This part of our program gives everybody an opportunity to think of questions for all 5 of our panelists today who were discussing the theological and historic backgrounds to the crisis. I teach here at Catholic U at the law school, so I am not a theologian or a historian. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to turn it to you for your questions. I only ask first that you keep your questions as brief as possible so that we can get to as many people's questions as possible. And also, if you indicate whether it is for a particular speaker or for the panel more generally, that would be very helpful. And microphones are making their way around, so please let me know if you have questions. And I believe there's a question right behind you, the gentleman in the red jacket.
Hi, thanks so much for coming in today. I just have some news. I found on Facebook today, of all things, that the Pope came out and admitted to sexual abuse of nuns by priests. I just wanted to know if you know anything about why this is coming to light now and what's being done for justice for this nuns, and is there any history of that in the church? I don't know if any of you are aware of that at all.
One reason it is getting attention now is because a magazine or a publication on women that's affiliated somehow with a Vatican publication. I'm sorry I can't tell you the name, but they just did a long article on it. And the problem of women religious being used as sex objects by priests and bishops, or raped or sexually assaulted. But it is something that among women religious has gotten attention for the last 20-some years.
It was a key piece of Protestant propaganda in the 16th century. Absolutely. And then usually in many cities where that turned Protestant, it gets even worse because in many cities they would sort of secularize the convents and dig up stones and find buried babies. So it was a very common piece of Protestant propaganda, not only that the priests were abusing the nuns or that the nuns were willingly engaging in sex with priests, but that they tended to kill their children. That was Protestant propaganda. So, yeah, there's evidence that some of it was true.
Other questions?
I just want to add there are a couple of cases in the past centuries where things like this did occur, and there were occasionally examples where the clerical and lay authorities worked together to punish the perpetrators. So I just want to make sure that that's said as well.
Yeah.
Over here on this side.
Sister Bauer, first of all, I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm very pleased we have someone who does not have an accent on this.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned that there are situations where the laity may be consulted with and they may give their opinions on matters they have knowledge of. In labor management relations, a labor union has certain things they bargain over, but there's other issues of which the union only has the right to consultation. Labor movement has understood this to mean it has to be informed, and therefore, if it's a consult with management, they must have access to any document or information that management would use in making the decision. Is that either understood or implied in canon law when the laity are consulted with? They have the same access to the
There are canons on when the law requires a superior to consult an individual or a body, such as a council. There are canons on how they must be convened. It doesn't say explicitly that they need certain information. My experience is, though, you have to get yes. For example, the Diocesan Finance Council is one that is consulted and in some cases must give consent in order for certain financial transactions. So they would need the necessary information. My own experience in my Benedictine community, and thank you for quoting the need to bring things to council, what we call council or chapter. The more important matters you bring to the whole community, and you listen to the young because the Holy Spirit often speaks to them. So there are lists of things both in the Universal Code of Canon Law and in the proper law of religious institutes for which the superior must either consult that council or that chapter or get the consent. And if you don't do that and you go ahead and place the act, it's invalid. But yes, they have to be convoked and et cetera. But you also have to look at the particular law of the diocese, or, for example, if it's a religious community, the proper law of the institute on more specifics. In our institute, it is possible to participate in a chapter via electronic means. So I get to sit in my easy chair here, while the sisters at St. Benedict's, love ya, get to sit in the wooden dining room chairs. And I can say whatever I want, et cetera, but that's in our proper law that we will do that. But so you always have to look at not just the code, but any, because not all the law of the church is in the code, the first thing you learn in canon law school. You have to look at other documents and then particular law.
I'd like to turn it over to Matt if we've gotten any questions online.
Just a question for Sister Nancy. As a Benedictine, you're familiar with the practicality of the rule of St. Benedict.
I love the rule.
How can the laity look to the rule for guidance/inspiration to heal the church in the wake of the crisis?
You know, I have often thought that the church, we are part of the church, obviously, but we have centuries of experience of consultation and superiors having to consult before making decisions, major decisions. And I really think we could be used as an example. We could offer some of the wisdom that we've acquired on how you can go about that. The superior is never forced to do anything. When the superior needs consent, it means she has the permission to do it, but it's not a demand to do it. And it's the same with the bishop, with the finance council. It gives him the permission to place certain financial transactions, but he's not required to do it. But if you're not going to follow the consent or the consultation, there should be some obligation to go back and explain. Now, anybody who's ever been in any superior position, like of a religious institute or a diocese, there's always something that the superior knows confidentially that they cannot share. That's sometimes where the tension comes in. If you consult and then make a different decision because you know something that you cannot share, that's just one of the, I guess that's how superiors live through the cross. But I'm sure that's part of bishops too. They know things about priests that the rest of us don't know and that they can't share, because priests do have, the code also provides us the right to our privacy and to a good reputation. There are other panelists here too that can answer questions.
Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, I think we'll go to this side now.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is for Dr. McShay. And my name is Jim Neighbors. I used to run the DoD Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. One of the things we put into place back in 2010 and 11 was an actual capability, and forgive me for the analysis of the military to the Catholic Church. I apologize for that right up front. However,
I studied the Jesuits, so I'm okay with that. Yeah.
However, we ran into the issue of undue command influence. I'll just call it that way, in which, in our case, the enlisted would not report against an officer in the case of something of this nature because of a fear of retribution, loss of everything. But we put in a reporting system worldwide during that time frame that allowed all of our troops to be able to report on anything they saw. To use a phrase, if you see something, say something, I think was... it has been extraordinarily successful from the point of view of pointing to how much the issue is at hand. where it is, when it is, what's involved. Any thought is the Catholic Church putting an actual capability to allow the laity to collaborate on what is happening? Thank you.
In terms of a similar structure of reporting? System. Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely an expert on the current ways of reporting to chanceries, et cetera. So I can't really speak to that very well, so, yeah.
In only one way, it's kind of similar to what the Inquisition was trying to do, right? Well, you know, with the difference that I guess in the DOD system, there's anonymity. Yeah, there can be. Well, for the Inquisition, there was no anonymity for the people who denounced or gave witness testimony. And that could lead to problems. So I think the anonymity, in case of somebody who's fearful that someone higher a position than they will rebuke them or actually, you know, cause them to be demoted, anonymity would be a good thing to have, or the possibility of anonymity.
Thank you. Okay, question over this way.
Well, I just wanted to follow up with your comment about anonymity, because we actually have that in healthcare. I was the head of a large program in an academic medical center. We had anonymous reporting if there were, you could use anonymous reporting for medical errors. And it was a very effective system. You had some occasional inappropriate reporting. Somebody was just angry at someone else, of course. But it solved a whole lot of issues because someone who felt that they were in a minority situation against a prominent voice could express that voice if they needed to, and it would be explored explicitly. I would say just one other thing about that. If we did not speak up, we were considered guilty of that malpractice, if there was a malpractice, for example. And we ought to give some thought to that as well as when we think of these issues.
Responses done. We'll go back to the online questions to see if anybody else has one.
This is for Professor Eyre. Based on your experiences as a youth, do you see any similarities between the destruction of the church by secular authorities in Cuba and the difficult situation of the church here in the United States?
I would make no comparisons, none. The situation in Cuba is vastly different from the situation here. There is no freedom of expression. There's no freedom for everyone. There's no freedom of expression, but for the church in particular, the church is constantly hamstrung. The Catholic Church actually gets better treatment than evangelical churches because the Catholic Church as an institution is organized in such a way that the government can control it more closely. So actually that's not a good thing, right? But the evangelical churches, they're loose cannons. So actually the fact that the Catholic Church is so well organized and that its episcopacy has, for the sake of staying in business, agreed to be subservient to what the state says, the church has been compromised. Here in the United States, we don't have any such problem.
Okay. The gentleman at the table in the back.
I'm sorry.
If I can make a quick follow-up, I think the question about Cuba brings to a head something I wanted to say, which is that some of the problem is the Catholic Church wants to respond this on the worldwide level. And that's understandable. The Catholic Church has resisted a sort of drift toward national churches, rightly so. I think if you look at Protestantism and at Orthodoxy, the drift to national churches is problematic. But here, there's a real difficulty in that you do have churches in some parts of the world, particularly communist countries, Cuba, Vietnam, China, and perhaps in some Muslim countries, where things like complete transparency, we open up all files to everybody, is far more problematic in a place where fairly oppressive state authorities are very difficult partners for the Catholic Church. So I think some of the hesitation at the worldwide level is trying to form a set of rules that would be the same, or structures that would be the same everywhere, when it's one thing in Cuba or China, another thing in, say, Turkey, and a quite different thing in the United States. That's some of the problem. I think there needs to be more flexibility in allowing, for example, reporting structures that may be rather different in some parts of the world than for others, or how one develops sensitivities for how things play out in different parts of the world. But I think, as we saw with the bishops here in November, some of the issue here is the difficulty of the Catholic Church trying to respond to particular issues in particular cultural and political situations, while still keeping some uniformity at the worldwide level, where it's one sort of thing in Cuba, another thing 90 miles away in Miami.
So my question, actually, I'm thinking back to President Garvey's analogy of the bride, and I'm trying to imagine, this came up earlier, I'm trying to imagine that I'm trying to be a better husband to my wife, but at the same time I know that my boss at any time could transfer me to a different wife. At whim. That makes it hard, it seems to me, to build the proper relationship to my wife. And so my question is, we've been talking a lot about, if you want to say the husband-wife relationship, the clergy-laity relationship. What needs to change in the governance structures of the clergy, in particular their relation to Rome, in order to make it possible for the laity to have the kind of voice that they need to have in relation to our American clergy?
That's a good question for anybody.
To continue the analogy, when your boss transfers you to another wife, your former wife still has to remain faithful to the new person transferred to her place. So even if she has no basis, and also in the marriage analysis, it works very well, but marriage also involves two people freely saying the same vows to each other. So there's a certain limit to that. So the marriage metaphor works on a mystical level, but I'm a little more comfortable sometimes speaking as a historian with some of the juridical norms and structural, even though we sometimes want to move away from that. I do think just this simple issue of moving pastors and bishops too much, it's really a fairly new phenomenon. I think I was not aware until recently that the term limits on pastors is as recent as the early 80s in the United States. So it strikes me that that's a fairly recent change, and the way things seem now as if they're sort of, we often assume that it's the way it's always been, and it really has not been. So I think changes like that, rethinking maybe term limits on pastors, that gives them a little more clout speaking to their bishop if they know that their job is more secure. In the early modern period, you had the problem before the Council of Trent of absentee bishops sort of living it up and court cities and stuff like that, and then Trent forced them to go back to their diocese and stay there. So they had the problem of absentee bishops. We have the problem of moving on up bishops, maybe, and sort of we need to kind of deal with that issue. I don't mean to make light of it. It's something that maybe we can discern at this moment as maybe an issue that we didn't realize it was an issue before. So that's just one thing I would throw in there. Anyone else would like to add?
I think another reality is that for Catholics, most Catholics, the bishop is a non-entity. Meaning it's not meaning that it has to do with him personally, but that he plays almost no role in the day-to-day life of believers. The pastor, the parish is what matters. Many Catholics will obviously know who the Pope is. They may not follow like what the Pope is doing, but they'll know the name or so on, but it doesn't affect their daily life. But it's the pastor who does. Whereas for pastors, the bishop is a huge figure in their life. And so I think we have different experiences of that in different ways. And so it would be interesting to see how do laity deal with sort of the shift of bishops or the transfer of bishops. How do clergy deal with that beyond inevitable retirements? And I think there's also a sense in which, sometimes you get the sense that some dioceses or churches are more important than others. If you're a rural diocese and you get a bishop who's in his early 50s, chances are he's not going to be there for 25 years. He's going to go somewhere else, and then you start to becoming like, well, we're the farm team, and that's bad. And the move is hard on people. I had a former pastor who spent the first year in our parish in a state of depression, minor depression, because he loved his previous parish and he didn't want to move. And he gave himself to our parish, but it was very hard for him. And that takes a toll on people. It's not just like changing spouses like that, but all that entails, it's very psychologically hard. Of course, sometimes the priest and the people are happy to move on from each other, or the bishop, but I think in general, the stability is what should be determined, and it helps people work things out. It helps people from kicking cans down the road and saying, my successor will take care of this. I don't have to make these decisions, or so on. So I'm a big believer on a variety of reasons, including Benedictine reasons, for stability.
There's a question here up front.
Thank you. One of the issues that hasn't been talked about, but maybe a side issue, is the civil rights of clergy. And I just wonder if anyone on the panel would like to comment on what may or may not be progressing in that direction.
Could you say what you mean by civil rights of clergy? I'm not quite sure.
Credible accusation is sufficient for punitive action.
Go ahead. I think this is a case where the upsides of the Dallas Charter, which have, I think, contributed to a decrease in sort of the tolerance of clerical sexual abuse. The downside is that I think the bishops in some ways have, I don't want to say have thrown their priests overboard, but they've set up a very difficult relationship. And because bishops failed to act earlier, they lost what I think is a rightful discretion in dealing with different cases. Now, every bishop is going to say, I'm going to report this right away under any circumstances. In the one sense, you can say, well, if it's not a credible accusation, then it will be, shown to be so. But there are priests who are in limbo, and there are priests who can't get their good reputation back, and they have no way of protecting themselves. And they can be put out of their rectories. They have to bear a real cross with that. I don't know the solution to that other than to say that it's a very real fear for priests. All it takes is one accusation and everything can spin out of control. And I think this is a further damage of the bishop's failure to act earlier, because they used their discretion wrongly in the past, not all, but some or many. And now they've lost that ability to use discretion. First, I think lay people suffered because of that, and then now I think a number of priests suffer because of that. I know Cardinal Dulles was a strong proponent of raising this issue about the rights of priests. Beyond that, canonically, I have no confidence, but it's an ongoing cross, I know, for many priests.
Can I add something? So the civil rights issue comes up also. We have this phenomenon of attorneys general of various states sort of targeting the church in particular, choosing not to necessarily look at other institutions. This is partly the issue, right, you're raising. And that's a serious issue, and I think it should give most Catholics pause to some degree, even if they feel like at this point we don't necessarily have options outside of that in some ways, as long as the leadership of the church continues to delay. To me, this question that I think the civil rights of priests is genuinely something potentially in danger in certain states, I don't know, I'm not an expert on the legal aspect, just underscores the need the bishops to respond more and allow the laity to help, because I would much rather see internal ecclesial mechanisms of lay investigation and ability to kind of address this problem before referring all accused priests immediately to the secular arm that is obviously no longer Catholic in most places. So I think it's a serious problem, and it makes the need for sort of lay co-responsibility all the more urgent, in my opinion. That's all I would say to that. So.
Question right back there.
Hi, this question is aimed at anyone on the panel, but it was provoked by questions that by things that Dr. Ruddy said. So I'm feeling sort of a relationship here and maybe a tension between, on the one hand, trust, and on the other hand, structures of accountability. Now, I think having more structures of accountability put into place sound like a good idea. On the other hand, they could just be, partly the reason they're needed so much is because people don't trust one another anymore. And they could just be a new place for people to be mistrustful and be wary. So apart from structures of accountability, what can be done to get people in the church, laity, ordinary priests, bishops, to trust one another more so that they have a little bit more room to work together?
I think the first thing is to admit when you've done wrong, whoever that is. When you stop trying to cover your rear end and you just say, I dropped the ball on this, or I messed up, I did something wrong, and you take the hit for it. When there is self-sacrificing behavior, that's what I think, in a marriage and a friendship, that's what deepens trust. And in some senses, as I said in my paper, people will sin, people will commit crimes. It's not to excuse that, but it's the cover-up. It's the refusal to acknowledge that's the thing. Are structures of accountability and trust inversely proportional? I wouldn't say that. I'm not saying that you say that, but I just would like to see more genuine repentance, not just on bishops, but on whomever's part, that costs something. That's not just words.
Maybe one last question from our online audience.
This could be for anyone, but in particular, it's for the historians and for Professor Root. In the past, there were definite sacral components to lay offices, for example, the coronation of monarchs. Especially in that light, what effect did the collapse of Catholic monarchies, especially in the wake of the French Revolution and World War I, have on the sort of the influence of the laity?
Well, I guess that I've laid myself open to questions like that with some things I've said and written. So, I mean, my general point that I recently argued in one article, a short article, it did sort of, it gave, the laity had a way, at least some lay persons, when you did have a Catholic states, a sort of consolidated, something kind of on the level of the bureaucracy of the church. So you could talk about kind of a marriage of church and state in a more kind of terms of equals to some degree. And once that's gone, you have this new problem that I raised briefly of you could be a Catholic layman working for a state bureaucracy, and you have sort of new scruples about sort of using secular power, to investigate the church and so on. But there's also this, I sketch it out, not to recommend my article, but I explain it much more eloquently than I can at a microphone, but there was a tendency, the church, to preserve its liberty from these newly aggressive secular states, started to kind of phase out a lot of sort of lingering ways of selecting bishops in different ways, sort of lay control, and also control by lower clergy, monastics, these different ways of kind of having some input on the governance of the church. They start to get sort of phased out, and the powers get absorbed by the episcopate and the papacy in a kind of more bureaucratized way. So I feel like there's a story there that I've barely scratched the surface with, and by looking at it straight on it's not necessarily that we need to kind of look back at this model of church governance in the past, but maybe there are sort of things that we lost that we didn't realize that we lost until fairly recently. So I don't know if another historian would like to
Just
step in and say.
one very obvious change when you have a secular state, be it a monarchy or a democracy or anything else, is that Rome becomes a lot more important. Rome literally becomes more central, because what these sacred monarchies tried to do constantly in Europe before Europe became secular was to control the church as much as possible. So the authority then resides in Rome, not in Paris or Madrid or any of the places where the monarchs hang out.
I can say two quick things. One, I do think it points to the importance of prying apart the lay clergy issue and the church-state issue, which have often read and piggyback on each other, but are today clearly different. Second, part of the problem is when Luther called for lay intervention, when the bishops wouldn't act, you knew perfectly who the lay people were. I mean, they were the princes, or in city councils in some places. The problem now is not clear who the lay people are with whom the clergy is to collaborate. I mean, that changes the situation when you no longer have a clearly Christian nobility and state structure. And there's the problem then that the church will select the clergy will select the lay people that they want, whereas they were stuck with whoever the Duke of Saxony or the King of France was. So we are in a transition period here, which requires both some structural ways of change and some conceptual ways of change.
Well, before we conclude, one quick question for everybody on the panel. You've discussed complicated issues today, and there's certainly not one single thought to guide us going forward. But if you had one thing that you would want to share as something to keep in mind as inspiration going forward, anything that you would want to leave us with as your last remarks to the group before we wrap up?
I've done a lot more thinking about holiness in relation or since this happened, and have been very conscious of looking for holiness, and I'm surprised at how much of it I see and find in not only the Christian faithful, but all the people I encounter. The parents walking their children to school on the streets of DC, waiting for buses, the homeless people, going to parishes and watching parents with their children. That kind of keeps me, I think, on an even keel. Look for holiness.
If there's one takeaway point I want everyone to take away, is that the church's history, the church, her experience, there's a lot there in the past we can look to for some inspiration, some insights about lay co-responsibility with the clergy that does not involve revolutionary or even Madisonian nice constitutional overthrows of the church hierarchy. I think the Catholic tradition has things in it already, and we can also get insights from our Protestant brethren as well without becoming the Lutheran Church or another church. So that's what I would like people to take away from me.
Yeah, I would second that. And if there's anything left that I have to add about history and how it can help us, is precisely what I said before, that it teaches us to be always vigilant, have faith, have hope, relish the holiness of the people who display it, but always be on the lookout for things that have been happening for 2,000 years or more, because if it's been happening for 2,000 years, right, any actuary could tell you there's a high chance it's going to happen again.
One would be that the truth will set you free. And I think people, at minimum, have to stop telling lies or misdirecting things and speak truth wherever they are in the church or the world. And I think, I mean this in a positive sense, I sometimes have heard the phrase keeping your powder dry. And I think that one thing that this crisis has brought home to me, in a way that I think even 2002 didn't, was that you can sometimes say, well, now's not the time to speak or act or do something. I have to keep my powder dry for something in the future. And I think, in one sense, I don't mean to be militaristic about this, but that I think that the crisis that the Catholic Church in the U.S. is undergoing right now, both internally and I think in different ways in its engagement with the broader culture, the point is not to sort of start firing away violently, but I think to be able to speak truth and to not be afraid of consequences with that. To do so, to speak the truth with love, but to do so with boldness.
My going ahead thought, I mean, fairly prosaically, is a motto of scholastic theology: distinguish in order to unite. One makes distinctions, but you have to pull them back together. I think the distinction of clergy and laity is grounded in the divine constitution of the church and part of the strength of the Catholic tradition. But one distinguishes always to unite. We're not going to deal with these issues except by the collaboration and cooperation, the unity of clergy and laity together. We need to distinguish, but always to unite.
And conveniently, Dr. Root has the microphone, so I will turn this back to him to call our session to an end.
Let me thank you all for coming. I hope you've found this informative and helpful on the way forward. I would note this was designed to be part of a unity. This and the following two. This was sort of an introduction, in some ways rather abstract, historical and theological. Well, abstract theologically, history always ends up being more concrete. The next conference on the 26th of March here at CUA will be on the causes of the crisis, a rather different kind of session. Then on the 25th of April, we will really get practical and ask, given these backgrounds we've had today, given an analysis of the causes, what can laity concretely do to engage these issues? We hope you'll be with us on those two further sessions. Thank you for being with us today. Goodbye.